Worcestershire sauce, or Worcester sauce if you prefer. We're going to look at the history of this iconic condiment, but it won't be the usual story about an aristocrat asking Mr. Lea and Mr. Perrins to recreate a sauce he'd enjoyed during his time in India, because I don't think that's actually true. Along the way, we're also going to look into some historic sources I think are fundamental to how Worcestershire sauce really came about. The now mostly forgotten Harvey sauce and Reading sauce, plus a few related condiments which also emerged in the 19th century and some of you may be familiar with today, like Yorkshire Relish and Henderson's Relish. Today, the most famous among all of these brands is undoubtedly Lea and Perrins Worcestershire sauce, as it says on the bottle, the original and genuine since 1837. But was it really Lea and Perrins who started this whole thing? I'm not so sure. Before we get into the history of Worcestershire sauce and how it relates to those other sauces, we should start by trying to pin down what exactly it is. It's a sauce which seems to tingle all 5 components of your sense of taste at the same time. It's simultaneously sweet, sour, bitter, salty, savoury and spicy. Oh wait, that's 6, isn't it? Arguably though, the key thing it delivers is that savouriness, or as the Japanese would say, umami. The modern UK version of Lea and Perrins Worcestershire sauce lists the following ingredients. Essentially vinegar, molasses, sugar, salt, anchovies, tamarind, onion, garlic, spices and flavourings. The US version is a bit different and also has different packaging, rather than that orange label we're familiar with over this side of the pond. The vinegar is a bit different and we're told a bit more about the spices there, cloves and chili pepper extract. We don't know exactly what the original recipe of Lea and Perrins Worcestershire sauce was when it first emerged in the 1830s, but some recipes are given for generic versions later in the 19th century. One from the American Chemical Review of 1885, and a fairly similar looking one in Pharmaceutical Formulas of 1898. In Practical Knowledge for the People, in 1891, a similar recipe is even presented as specifically being for Lea and Perrins Worcestershire sauce, although I somehow doubt the authority of that. Interestingly, none of these recipes use anchovies. However, there is, surprisingly, liver boiled for 12 hours. That presumably fills a similar role there, delivering the umami. Neither the molasses nor the tamarind are present either, but we do have mushroom and walnut ketchup as well as soy sauce. Then a selection of spices, cayenne, ginger, black pepper, allspice, coriander, mace, cinnamon and asafoetida. William Shirtleff and Akiko Aoyagi's incredibly painstakingly researched book on the history of Worcestershire sauce also states that soy sauce was actually a secret ingredient in Lea and Perrins up to World War II, when they had to find a replacement due to supply issues. Much has been said about the history of Worcestershire sauce, but I also think a certain amount of mythology has built up around its origin, and I'm going to try and stick to the facts. In the 1830s, John Wheely Lee and William Henry Perrins were 2 chemists operating from a shop on Broad Street in Worcester. Sometime in that decade, they started producing a sauce and decided to call it Worcestershire sauce. The origins of the recipe, however, are a bit less clear-cut, and I suspect there has been some embellishment of this story over the years. What I believe to be the first newspaper adverts for Lea and Perrins Worcestershire sauce appear in 1840 and contain a claim that it is prepared by us from the favourite recipe of a nobleman of acknowledged goût. That's the French word for taste there. They also lead with, so many sauces under every variety of name have been of late contending for public favour. That statement to me is quite intriguing. The following year we're given a bit more of a hint about the identity of that nobleman, who is here described as in the county, presumably that means Worcestershire. It's not until some time later that the identity of that enigmatic nobleman is revealed. Possibly the first public accounts of that are in 1867, I think starting with this obituary for Mr. Perrins in Barrow's Worcester Journal. Herein they let slip some possibly hitherto unpublished local knowledge. The writers at the journal believe the source, presumably they're talking about the recipe, was received from Lord Sandys of Ombersley Court. Ombersley Court is the family seat of the Barons Sandys and currently up for sales, it happens, if you happen to have 15 million quid to hand. However, the article doesn't say exactly which of the Baron Sandys they're referring to. In the 1860s, the title had been held by 3 different family members, with the 2nd Baron dying in 1860, the 3rd in 1863, so the 4th would have held that title at the time of the obituary, but they're referring referring to events which took place likely before any of those three held it. It was later claimed that the nobleman in question was the third Baron, who, prior to taking the title, was known as Lord Marcus Hill. Some versions of the story even claim that he was a one-time governor of Bengal. The earliest telling I found is in 1939, and as that includes the name Marcus, it does seem to be talking about the third Baron. However, historian Martin Davis has written a very thorough biography of the third Baron Sandys, based primarily on an extensive archive of letters the family had kept. From this and other sources, we have a very good idea of his whereabouts throughout his life. He did travel, to Europe mainly, on diplomatic assignments before later becoming an MP. But there is no written record of him ever being the Governor of Bengal, nor of him ever travelling to India, and I think we can be fairly sure he never did. And I can't help but think that the talk of some faraway origin and foodie aristocrats is a way of distracting from the fact that other similar sources already existed in England when Lea and Perrins first made theirs. Something they themselves draw attention to in those earliest adverts. So many sources under every variety of name have been of late contending for public favour. I don't think it's contested that they were the first to use the name Worcestershire Sauce, but rather than the inspiration for it coming from an exotic concoction of some far-flung corner of the empire, instead it's quite possibly a riff on one or more sauces which were already being made elsewhere in England. You might think that the Georgian era in England was a time of very bland and unadventurous food, all produced domestically. But take a look at this advert for another chemist shop, coincidentally also in Worcester, and surprisingly this is as early as 1758. Quite a lot of delicacies on offer there, which you might consider to be more modern introductions to the English diet. Anchovies, capers, olives, Florence oil, that's olive oil, truffles and morels. Also note East India soy. That's soy sauce, likely imported by the Dutch East India Company and potentially even originating in Japan. At this time, during Japan's period of isolation, the Dutch were the only nation permitted to trade with them via an island called Deshima off the coast from Nagasaki. After that, we have mushroom catsup, which we know today as mushroom ketchup, and that can be thought of as a European equivalent to soy sauce, a salty, savoury condiment which contained that all-important umami flavour. Add to that a couple of different types of vinegar, those anchovies, that East India soy sauce, and you have the basis for making several sauces which emerged around the late 18th or early 19th century, several decades before Worcestershire sauce, and I think these precursors were probably the inspiration for it. A recipe for Hare Soup in 1868 shows how many of these condiments performed a similar role in cooking at that time, essentially delivering that umami component. The recipe suggests any or several of the following sauces: essence of anchovy, soy, Worcestershire, Reading or Harvey sauce, mushroom or walnut ketchup. Those two brand name sauces, Reading and Harvey's, were already known in the early 1800s, long before anyone had ever heard of Worcestershire sauce. Perhaps the best known of the two was Harvey's sauce. The first written reference I found to it is this footnote in an advert of 1793. It was created by Peter Harvey, who gave his name to it, and he passed on the recipe to Elizabeth Lazenby. In some accounts she was his sister, in others his daughter. It went on to be produced by E. Lazenby and Sons for well over a century. We don't know the exact recipe for Harvey's sauce, now long since extinct, and of course at this period of history there were no food labelling regulations which would have required them to write the ingredients on the label. However, several cookbooks in the 19th century have recipes for a homemade version. These were probably just educated guesses by cooks of the day rather than based on anything official, but they probably gave a good general sense of what went into it. In the Lady's Own Cookery book of 1844, we have the following: walnut ketchup, anchovies, soy, cayenne, garlic and white wine vinegar. Whereas Pharmaceutical Formulas of 1898 has anchovies, lemon peel, shallots, pimento, horseradish, walnut pickle and mushroom ketchup. Other accounts of Harvey's sauce suggest the key ingredients were vinegar, soy sauce, mushroom and or walnut ketchup, anchovies, garlic and cayenne. And somewhere between those two recipes we've just seen, we have roughly that set, I think. Doesn't that sound pretty similar to the ingredients for Worcestershire sauce? There were several high-profile court cases in the early 1800s where E. Lazenby and Son sued other producers who were imitating their sauce. As this account says, the celebrity of the article induced many persons to counterfeit it, and the fame of Harvey's sauce was further underlined by Lord Byron referencing it in his 1817 poem Beppo. Harvey's sauce was widely advertised throughout the first few decades of the 1800s, often using those adverts to air their grievances with their imitators, and there's even a note that the bottles for a while came wrapped in a paper listing all of the previous actions they had taken in court against other would-be producers of bootleg Harveys. I think there's a very strong chance Mr. Lea and Mr. Perrins would have known of Harvey's sauce. As we saw in that 1758 advert for Thomas and James Bowyer, it was common in the Georgian era for chemists and druggists to also sell culinary products like oils, vinegars and sauces. That's the same line of work they were in prior to their discovery of Worcestershire sauce. Admittedly, a bit of conjecture there, but the other precursor to Worcestershire sauce we touched on earlier has even stronger evidence suggesting Lea and Perrins would have known it. I think Reading sauce came slightly later than Harvey's sauce, but still long before Worcestershire sauce, and as the name suggests, it originates in the town of Reading. The earliest adverts for it appear around 1805, and already by this time it was being sold outside its native Reading, in towns like Oxford, Bath and in London. There's an intriguing note at the bottom that it is generally used at table as a substitute for India soy, lemon pickle, Quin sauce, etc. Quin sauce in particular deserves further investigation, and we'll come back to it a bit later. The Lady's Own Cookery book does not contain a recipe for Reading sauce. The later pharmaceutical formulas of 1898, however, does, and again we're going to see a continuation of this theme. Anchovies, soy, mushroom ketchup, vinegar and spices. Reading Museum has a page on their website about Reading sauce, and they say the main ingredients of the original sauce were walnut ketchup, mushroom ketchup, soy sauce, anchovies, chilies, spices, salt and garlic. They then add, Worcester sauce is the nearest modern equivalent. In this advert of 1816, you can see Cox's Reading sauce is being marketed to the nobility and families of Worcester directly, cautioning against the imitations which seem to plague these 19th century sauce producers. And you can see it is sold in Worcester by J and E Evans, chemists and druggists. Now, I know that's not quite the smoking gun that finding an advert showing Lea and Perrins themselves selling Reading sauce would have been, but a good 2 decades before Worcestershire sauce was announced to the world, we have a very similar sauce being sold in Worcester at another shop in the city in the same line of business that Lea and Perrins were in. Again, it seems incredibly likely Lea and Perrins would have known Reading sauce. Reading sauce gets a mention in Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Phileas Fogg has it with his breakfast at the Reform Club to flavour some broiled fish. I think Reading sauce may have disappeared sometime in the mid-20th century. The last newspaper advert I was able to find for it was from 1930, at which time it's described as the champagne of sauces, and there's a claim it goes back to 1789, which if true could make it even slightly older than Harvey's. As noted, I think Quin sauce is worthy of further investigation. I'm not sure this was ever a branded product as such in the same way Harvey's or Reading sauce were. Instead, I think this was a recipe attributed to an individual, Mr. Quin. If we again consult the Lady's Own Cookery book of 1844, we have a recipe for it there. As before, this is not necessarily definitive, just one author's interpretation, but we have mushroom ketchup, walnut pickle, anchovies, garlic, cayenne pepper. It sounds remarkably familiar, doesn't it? In fact, there's an earlier recipe where it's described as a favourite sauce of Mr. Quin's, said to be compounded by himself in The Modern Art of Cookery in 1767 by Anne Shackelford. Fairly similar ingredients there: walnut pickle, mushroom ketchup, garlic, anchovies, cayenne pepper, and here we also have horseradish. I believe Mr. Quin is referring to James Quin, a celebrated actor of his day. Given that this 1767 recipe, published a year after his death, predates both Harvey's and Reading sauces by several decades, and given the similarities in the ingredients, it's tempting to think this could actually have been the inspiration for both of those sauces, and therefore also, indirectly, of Worcestershire sauce. We should touch on some of the other contemporaries of Worcester sauce. Goodall's Yorkshire Relish hails from Leeds and first appears in newspaper adverts in the 1860s. I believe that has a recipe for a generic version in pharmaceutical formulas of 1898, and yet again we see those similar ingredients reoccurring: anchovies, soy, vinegar, mushroom ketchup, walnut pickle, cayenne, and so on. By the 1930s, Goodall's produced both a thick and a thin version of Yorkshire Relish, with, I believe, the thick version being what we'd consider to be a brown sauce today. Similarly to what we saw with chef sauce in the brown sauce video, I think it was around the 1930s that production of Yorkshire Relish also began in Ireland. Even though Yorkshire Relish was eventually discontinued here in Britain, it still survives in two forms in Ireland today. The thicker brown sauce is now sold as YR, a naming convention reminiscent of HP, A1 and OK. And the original thinner Worcestershire sauce-like product is sold as Yorkshire Relish. Different online listings seem to have subtly different ingredients, but roughly speaking it seems to be vinegar, sugar, soy sauce and some other flavourings. No anchovies there, nor any molasses or tamarind as far as I can tell. Goodall's Yorkshire Relish is not to be confused with Henderson's Relish. This also hails from Yorkshire, as it happens, but rather than Leeds, Henderson's Relish was born in Sheffield. It emerged somewhat later than the others. Their website states Henry Henderson first concocted it in 1885. The ingredients today are as follows, and like the Yorkshire Relish, there are no anchovies here, nor do I think this contains molasses. Presumably there wouldn't be the need to use caramel for colouring, were that the case, but it does contain tamarind. Until relatively recently, it wasn't well known outside of its hometown, illustrated by this newspaper advert in 1985, where it seems, even in Nottinghamshire, it was considered something of an oddity, and one which presumably would only appeal to Yorkshire exiles. I have in the last couple of years started to see it on shelves down here in London, so perhaps it will become a little better known. I'm definitely a fan. There are many more related 19th century sauces I could have covered here, but hopefully I have illustrated that prior to the invention of Worcestershire sauce, England was by no means a barren gastronomic landscape, and there was no dearth of liquid table condiments. And indeed, at least two sauces already existed prior to the 1830s, which shared many similarities with Worcester's most famous export. That is not to say Mr. Lea and Mr. Perrins did not make a worthwhile contribution to the field. Their sauce was clearly not an exact clone of either Harvey's or Reading sauce. It couldn't have been. The precise recipes for both were closely guarded secrets. They made something in that vein, but different enough to make a name for itself, and it has outlived the other two. What we can say with a reasonable level of certainty is that they were the first people to call it Worcestershire sauce, and in doing so they made it very hard to say that they didn't invent Worcestershire sauce. But was Worcestershire sauce really a significantly new thing, or was it a tweaking of a style of sauce which had already been around for decades? And should we really be giving at least some of the credit to 18th century actor James Quin? And of course, any sauce historian worth their salt would quickly tell you there was a precursor to all of this as far back as ancient Rome and even ancient Greece in the form of garum, a sauce similarly made of fermented fish and full of salt and umami. Perhaps Lea and Perrins and even Quin were just part of a very long and convoluted lineage of this condiment spanning millennia. I hope that's been interesting. I'm off for a Bloody Mary now. Thanks for watching.